How do we understand French colonialism in North America? How did the French interact with their Indigenous neighbors? And how has the way we've understood French colonialism changed over time? Today, we're going to focus on one book that has really reshaped the way that we understand French colonialism, and also why the book's come under scrutiny as historians have started to think more about Indigenous histories as well as imperial ones. When talking about the history of French imperial expansion into North America, few books can be claimed to be as influential as Richard White's now classic study, The Middle Ground: Indians, Empires, and Republics in the Great Lakes region, 1850 to 1815. The Middle Ground, as the abstract for the 20th anniversary edition states, tells how Europeans and Indians met, regarding each other as alien, as other, as virtually non-human, and how, between 1615 and 1815, they constructed a common, mutually comprehensible world in the region around the Great Lakes that the French called the Pays et Notes. Here, the older system of Algonquins and the various Europeans overlapped, and their mixture created new systems of meaning and exchange. Finally, the book tells of the breakdown of accommodation and common meanings, and the reintroduction or the recreation of the Indians as alien and exotic. The French Pays et Notes refers to the territories west of Montreal. White's concept has been criticized nearly as loudly as it's been praised, particularly when it's been applied outside of New France. Now 30 years old, scholars are starting to recognize some of the study's limitations. One such limitation is that, because White decided to study New France for his book, his findings can feed into a myth that the French practiced a kinder form of colonialism than other imperial regimes in North America. As Scott Berthelette, an assistant professor at Queen's University, explained.
I think because of their relatively small settler population, because of their proclivity to making alliances of trade and sort of diplomatic or military alliances with Indigenous peoples, I think the French are sometimes mistakenly remembered as being somehow more fair or more of the sort of benign colonizers when it comes to Indigenous people in North America. But I think this is largely untrue. Similar to their Spanish and British counterparts, I would say the French also wanted to control peoples, territories, and resources in their overseas colonies. And just like their Spanish and English counterparts, they often were at war with Indigenous people.
When White first published his study in 1991, he contended that his study might be used as a model for other multi-ethnic spaces in North America. However, scholars like Kathleen Duval, author of The Native Ground, now recognize that Europeans occupied Indigenous spaces really more commonly because Indigenous peoples allowed them to.
The Haudenosaunee never wanted to build here at Cataraqui. The name Cataraqui itself, the city of Kingston website will tell you that it means place where there was limestone or the place where there was clay. But speaking to some other Indigenous linguists, I mean, it seems to mean the place where there is a lot of mud because it is watery. And when the French built here, it was a very muddy and very swampy place, the inner harbor, which the French desired so that they could have sort of a Lake Ontario fleet of ships larger than canoes, was good for that, but it was also a very bad place to grow crops because of how swampy and muddy it was. So it seems that even the name Cataraqui has this origin with mud and not so much with limestone.
Especially when Indigenous populations outnumbered those of European colonists, Europeans were largely peripheral to the larger Indigenous politics at play, in a way that historians have not traditionally understood, and White's study assumes European centrality. Indigenous confederacies tended to be occupied with rivalries with other Indigenous groups, and comparatively less concerned by the lesser threat posed by Europeans. Duval finds that Indigenous sovereignty or agency really only came under threat when Indigenous populations began to be outnumbered by European ones, so that, quote, only relatively weak people desired the kinds of compromises inherent to a middle ground. That is, White's concept only really applied in situations where Indigenous populations had been significantly reduced by war, enslavement, or disease. Duval instead posed the concept of native ground. In contrast to White, who stresses the co-production of power dynamics, Duval argues that Indigenous peoples, rather than Europeans, determined the form and content of relationships in most cases. Focusing on the Arkansas Valley, Duval shows that until the 19th century, Europeans tended to be more dependent on Indigenous peoples than the other way around. While it is true that a middle ground took shape in the Payson Note, focusing primarily on the relationships between the French and their Indigenous allies places the French as central to Indigenous politics, rather than as pawns in a larger web of alliances, conflicts, and rivalries. Looking more narrowly at a specific site illuminates the extent to which the French and their Indigenous neighbors took up this concept of middle ground. In fact, looking at how the Haudenosaunee operated in the same region that White proposed as middle ground enlightens us to the fact that this framework only really made sense when applied to the French and their allies, and that there was a native ground also at play in this very region. So today on Historia Nostra, we're digging further into how Indigenous politics determined the location, changing purpose, and influence of Fort Frontenac, and how the history of Fort Frontenac shows us that the middle ground was only one aspect of Indigenous history in this region. I'm going to let Dr. Scott Berthelette take over here to explain how Fort Frontenac fits within the Indigenous landscape of the 17th century Great Lakes.
So we're at the remains of Fort Frontenac. It's a French military fort and trading post originally built in 1673. And I think Fort Frontenac and even the ruins of Fort Frontenac are a testament to this imperialistic nature of French colonialism in North America. It was built in this time in the history of New France that they were at peace with the Haudenosaunee, or the Five Nations Iroquois, as they are sometimes called. Fort Frontenac was very purposely built on the doorstep of Iroquois with the intention to encircle the Haudenosaunee, to prevent them from basically pursuing their own policies, their own sort of self-determination in North America. So it's built very purposely for this reason, even though the French are at peace with the Haudenosaunee at the time of the fort's building. And this very important peace treaty was signed between New France and the Haudenosaunee in 1667, and this sort of allowed New France to expand outside of the St. Lawrence Valley. So sort of in this era of Governor Frontenac, we see the building of several posts. We see the building of Fort Frontenac here, sort of at the strategic location of the kind of where the St. Lawrence River meets Lake Ontario, and also the mouth of the Cataraqui River. So the sort of this meeting of these three significant waterways. We also see the building of Fort Conti at the mouth of the Niagara River, and we also see the building of Fort Dubois at the Straits of Mackinac in 1683, so kind of at the end of Governor Frontenac's tenure. So yeah, we see this expansion of the French as they sort of endeavor to control the fur trade of the Great Lakes Basin and of the Canadian Shield, so they're sort of moving into the interior. At the same time, though, they're also trying to build up this alliance between themselves and Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region. So there's this idea, yes, they have signed this peace treaty with the Haudenosaunee, who they had been at war with since really the beginning of New France. There's this temporary peace with the Haudenosaunee, but they know war is coming again. So you see in this era, the French are trying to build up this Franco-Indigenous alliance. At the same time, too, though, the 1667 peace treaty also gave the Haudenosaunee a chance to expand their frontiers. So we see between 1665 and 1670 that the Haudenosaunee build or establish 7 different villages on the north shore of Lake Ontario, between here at Cataraqui westward to Toronto. So we have especially see a lot of activity in the Bay of Quinte area just to the west of us here. So the Haudenosaunee are kind of also trying to, expand commercially, diplomatically, and militarily into the Great Lakes region. So we see this sort of arms race on the north shore of Lake Ontario in this period between the Haudenosaunee and the French. Fort Frontenac's primary purpose was military, to try and contain what they thought was the Haudenosaunee threat to the Great Lakes region. Because in the early 1600s, we see this Haudenosaunee expansion as they wage war against the Wendat, the Neutrals, the Eries, and a number of other Iroquoian-speaking peoples who they sort of defeat, disperse, and sometimes incorporate into their own league, the sort of League of Peace and Power. So, in a way, the French are sort of unwittingly drawn into this conflict when Samuel de Champlain founds Quebec in the early 1600s. His first allies are the Montagnais, or the Innu people, and then later he's introduced to the Wendat and the Algonquin, and they're already at war with the Haudenosaunee. So he's sort of drawn into these pre-existing patterns of warfare. But he kind of goes, full force in with his allies, especially the Wendat, and you see this battle, this sort of famous battle at Lake Champlain in 1609, when Samuel de Champlain, who named the lake after himself, of course, kills 3 Mohawk chiefs in battle. And then this, sort of obviously leads to further warfare with the Haudenosaunee, making them sort of firm enemies of New France, really throughout the 17th century. By the time of 1649 to 1650, we see the Haudenosaunee defeat the Wendat, and they're defeated. They're not destroyed. This is sort of an old colonial myth that the Wendat ceased to exist after 1649-50, and then I guess in around the 1660s, you see the French king finally agree to send a contingent of soldiers to help fight the Haudenosaunee. So here you have the arrival of the Carignan-Sallier regiment, and they don't actually meet the Haudenosaunee in open battle, but they do burn a lot of villages. They destroy crops. They burn granaries, and then this is why the Haudenosaunee nations agree to this temporary peace in 1667. We see a resumption of the so-called Iroquois Wars in the 1680s as the Haudenosaunee begin to attack people not of the sort of upper Great Lakes, as the French intended to prevent them from reaching, but people of the southern Great Lakes and even the Mississippi Valley. So in the 1680s, we see the Haudenosaunee pushing kind of southward through the Ohio Valley and really, yes, to the eastern shore of the Mississippi River as they attack Miami's and Illinois people. And this alarms the French because the French, especially under La Salle, have expanded there as well, and they've made new allies as they've arrived there. So we see a resumption of hostilities with the Haudenosaunee in the 1680s period. And war indeed breaks out between them in 1684. And Fort Frontenac serves in a way as this very convenient location for New France and their Great Lakes allies to sort of gather, to arm themselves, and to raid into Iroquois, so the Haudenosaunee homeland of kind of upstate New York, as well as to raid the Haudenosaunee villages on the north shore of Lake Ontario. And the Haudenosaunee themselves recognize that that Fort Frontenac sort of constitutes this military and commercial threat. And they also recognize this policy of encirclement. A Haudenosaunee leader even threatens the French governor in 1695, saying, quote, "Your fire shall burn no more at Cataraqui. It should never be kindled again," end quote. But Fort Frontenac, nevertheless, persists as sort of this thorn in the side of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy throughout this period. And sorry, like I was saying, French governors organize military campaigns against the Haudenosaunee from here, and it serves as sort of the staging ground and gathering place as French troops come from the east, from Montreal, from Trois-Rivières, from Quebec, and Indigenous warriors like the Ojibwe, Mississauga, Odawa, Wendat, Menominee, Potawatomi, Meskwaki, Sauk, and Ho-Chunk arrive from the west, from the Great Lakes region. They gather here. So you have these journeys of these French diplomats like Nicolas Perrault and Duluth and all these other guys sort of traveling throughout the Great Lakes and cajoling these Indigenous warriors to come with him to Fort Frontenac so that they can organize these expeditions. And these joint French Indigenous military expeditions would happen every few years. So there's one in 1684 and 1687, 1692 and 1696. And they comprise armies between 1,000 to 2,000 combatants. So these are huge, huge expeditions. We see an end to warfare in 1701. This is, I guess, a very famous event in Canadian history. The Great Peace of Montreal brings an end to the Iroquois Wars. And the French, the Haudenosaunee, and some 39 other Indigenous nations gather in Montreal in August of 1701 to negotiate a peace treaty. As part of this peace treaty, though, it is agreed that the Haudenosaunee and other Great Lakes people, like the Mississaugas, have agreed to share the hunting territory on the north shore of Lake Ontario. However, after the peace treaty, the Haudenosaunee found that this was being violated. So, for example, we see one Onondaga leader complain to the governor that this wasn't being respected. He said, quote, "The tongue of land at Fort Frontenac belongs to us. It is the place where we have been hunting since the world is the world, and no other nation has ever hunted there. We were surprised to find both Algonquins and Nipissings there, numbering 200, who have taken over those areas that belong to us," end quote. So we sort of see the North Shore of Lake Ontario, or at least Indigenous relations on the North Shore of Lake Ontario, enter this very interesting phase of its history. Because by this time, the 7 Haudenosaunee villages have been evacuated, largely pushed back by Wendat and Anishinaabe warriors. But around Fort Frontenac, we sort of see this enclave of Haudenosaunee settlement, because now they're relying on French protection and French mediation to allow them to access these hunting territories on the north shore of Lake Ontario. And we know that we know through lots of sources, we know that there is a Haudenosaunee population that sort of persists here. But an interesting one is this plan of a fort done by a French military engineer, where he shows the élévation des cabanes sauvages. So he shows these, he doesn't specify, because of course in French, sauvage, I mean, some have translated to savages, but more likely wild men, Indigenous people basically he's referring to, but doesn't really specify which group is there. But we know from the drawing and from the sketch that it is a building with vertical sides, a domed roof, 2 smoke holes, and a bark door. And it clearly resembles an Iroquoian longhouse and not an Anishinaabe birch bark wigwam. So it's kind of this clear visual evidence that the Haudenosaunee, who have been referred to, of course, as the people of the Longhouse, lived around Fort Frontenac in the 18th century, and probably continued to do so as a sort of isolated settlement until the British captured the fort in 1758 at the end of the 7 Years' War. And it's interesting, too, because even today in the 21st century, we know that there are Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe communities who continue to live and thrive along the north shore of Lake Ontario, but even, as well as here in Kingston, around the vestiges of Fort Frontenac.
So while the French-Haudenosaunee relations became less violent over time, this only really makes sense when the Indigenous contexts are taken into account. It's not that the French and Haudenosaunee formed a middle ground. It's more that the French exercised influence over the Haudenosaunee rivals, and they recognized this and took advantage of it.
Yeah, in a way, it's sort of this... It ironically becomes sort of a shelter that allows this Haudenosaunee population to continue to exist on the north shore of Lake Ontario. Despite the fact that its original intention was to encircle and sort of prevent the Haudenosaunee from expanding here. In a way, too, the whole plan of Fort Frontenac to encircle the Haudenosaunee and prevent them from expanding in the 17th century kind of didn't pan out anyway, whereas the French built one settlement on the north shore of Lake Ontario, the Haudenosaunee built 7 further west. So in a way, it wasn't really successful. If anything, sometimes the Haudenosaunee would take the other way around Lake Ontario, and therefore their village at Toronto became a bit more important.
The history of Fort Frontenac indicates that, where the Pays and Note overlapped Iroquois, it's not accurate to call this region a middle ground, because to do so overestimates French power in the area. The French and Haudenosaunee had tumultuous relations through the 17th and 18th centuries, and while White never contended that the middle ground extended to the Haudenosaunee, the emphasis scholars have placed on the middle ground has obscured the native ground that sites like Fort Frontenac inhabited. It's a common myth that French colonialism was less brutal than other forms of colonialism practiced in North America. It's also popular to overstate French influence over and control of Indigenous spaces. By recognizing both the applications for and limitations of concepts like White's middle ground and Duval's native ground at specific sites like Frontenac, we get a better picture of the complex Indigenous politics that ultimately shaped how different empires operated in North America. Thank you very much to Dr. Scott Berthelette for contributing to today's episode, and to Caitlin Steva for the footage taken at Fort Frontenac. Our theme music is by Brooke for Free. You can learn more at brookeforfree.bandcamp.com.
Oh, hi.